This is a made-up story meant to be fun. Please leave a comment below to let us know where you are watching from. It's always interesting to see how far these stories can go. In the fall of 1904, something happened in the remote hollows of Tucker County, West Virginia, that would affect the area for many years to come. There isn't much official information about the event itself. It's mostly found in bits and pieces in city archives, old newspaper articles, and the quiet memories of families who used to live near what locals would later call the Stillwater property. People in the area still talk about it in hushed tones. Few people are willing to walk the overgrown path that used to lead to the main house, which has now collapsed into the ground that held it. The property in question was about 12 miles northeast of Parsons and could only be reached by a narrow dirt road that wound through thick oak and hemlock forests. The road itself was hardly ever taken care of, and it was often. During the spring rains, it washed away, and in the winter, the snow could pile up to 3 or 4 feet deep in the hollows, making it impossible to get through. The closest homestead was 3 miles away, and there was a steep ridge between them that made it hard to visit each other casually, especially in the harsh mountain winters that could last from November to April. In the year 1904, Tucker County wasn't very populated, and families made a living by farming, hunting, and doing odd jobs. There were a lot of timber camps in the area. The land itself seemed to be made to keep people apart. There were deep valleys carved by old rivers and ridges that rose sharply and were covered in thick vegetation that made it hard to see more than a few dozen yards in many places. The property belonged to Cassius Hargrave, who was 47 years old at the time of the incident, and his wife Minerva, who was 42. Cassius bought the land in 1891, not long after moving to West Virginia from somewhere in eastern Pennsylvania. Even though official records never confirmed the exact location, he seemed to be purposefully vague when asked about where he came from. People who were interested in such things were surprised by the deal itself at the time. According to property records, he paid in full and in cash. Some people in the area were curious about where his money came from because of an unusual situation. The amount was big enough to buy the land and pay for the building of a house that was much bigger than the one they already had. More detailed than usual for the area, where most families lived in simple wooden buildings with only 4 or 5 rooms. The house Cassius built had 2 stories, a stone foundation, and a big basement that went under about half of the building's footprint. Building it took almost 2 years, from the spring of 1891 to the end of the summer of 1893. Cassius himself was in charge, with help from workers brought in from outside the county, men whose names were never written down in local, records of employment, and who left the area as soon as the work was done. This one detail was interesting. Most people who lived there hired local workers to do building projects. This saved them money and helped them get along with their neighbors, who might need their help in times of need or trouble. Cassius' choice to bring in workers from other places showed that he either had specific needs that local craftsmen couldn't meet, or that he wanted to keep the details of the construction secret from the public. Of people who could talk to other people in the community about what they had seen. Horace Delaney, a stonemason who worked on the project, later gave testimony that helps us understand how the building was put together. In 1949, when Delaney was 73 years old and lived in Maryland, a reporter from a local newspaper talked to him about his long career in construction trades that lasted for 5 decades. Delaney talked about his work on the Hargrave property during this interview, but he didn't seem very interested in it in detail, and his discomfort is still clear decades later. In an article that came out in the Cumberland Evening Times on March 12, 1949, Delaney said that Cassius Hargrave had very specific plans for the cellar. For example, there would be a separate room with reinforced walls made of stones chosen for their density and fitted with unusual precision. Delaney thought it was interesting that the floor of this room was built to slope very slightly toward a central drain. Strange, since these kinds of drains were usually only found in slaughterhouses, tanneries, or factories, not in homes. Delaney also said that Cases insisted on being there for all of the work on the cellar and got very upset if workers didn't follow his instructions exactly, even small things that don't seem important to the big picture. The special room's walls had to be exactly 7 feet high, not an inch more or less. The door was supposed to be at least 3 inches thick and made of solid oak. Thick, with hinges that could hold a lot of weight, and a lock mechanism that was very strong and that Cash had to order from a company in Pittsburgh. Cash has also made sure that the room is completely separate from the rest of the cellar, with a separate ventilation shaft that opens to the outside at ground level. This shaft was placed in such a way that it couldn't be easily seen from the house or yard, and Cases later planted a group of bushes to hide it. Delaney asked about the Cases only told him that he wanted to use the space for scientific work that needed a controlled temperature and protection from contamination. At first, this explanation seemed reasonable, because some educated men did do private research in a number of fields. However, Delaney later said he found it unsettling that Cases never went into detail about what kind of scientific work they were doing, and that the man's behavior when talking about the room made it seem like it was more than just a lab space. Delaney remembered that Cases was very interested in how the room was built. He paid obsessive attention to detail that went beyond normal concern for building practices. Cases would check every stone placement and mortar joint, run his hands over the walls, and check the measurements over and over again, even after Delaney told him the work was up to code. People in Parsons and the surrounding area quickly learned that Cases Hargrave was not a friendly person. After he got there, people who saw him in Parsons on his rare supply trips said he was takatur, polite but distant, always doing business with little conversation before going back to his property. He was about 5 feet 9 inches tall, and thin enough that some people thought he looked sick. He had dark hair that he wore longer than was fashionable at the time, and he often tied it back with a simple cord. His face was thin and angular, with high cheekbones and a big nose that stood out. He looked like an aristocrat, which didn't make sense because he chose to live in such a remote and rural area. He dressed neatly but simply, usually in dark colors like blacks and grays that made him look older than he was and gave him a funeral-like look that made people unconsciously stay away from him. Several people who talked to him said that he rarely made direct eye contact during conversations. Instead, he focused on whatever he was doing at the time, like counting money, checking a list of supplies, or looking at things before buying them. When he looked someone in the eye, it was unsettling in a way that was hard to put into words. It wasn't hostile or threatening. It was more like he was studying the person in front of him with the detached interest of a naturalist looking at an insect specimen under glass. This trait made shopkeepers and other people in town feel a little uneasy, even though most of them couldn't say why. It was just a feeling, and something about Cassius Hargrave didn't sit right with her gut. She thought that underneath his polite exterior, he was cold and calculating. People saw his wife, Minerva, even less often than they saw him. The Hargraves lived on the property for 13 years, and during that time, she went to town about a dozen times with her husband, always quiet. People who remembered her said she was of average height and had light brown hair that she usually wore in a tight bun that made her skin look stretched, on her forehead and temples. No matter what time of year it was, she always wore dark, long-sleeved dresses. Even in the summer, when the heat was unbearable and the humidity made the air feel thick and hard to breathe, she wore them. The dresses were well made, but they weren't fashionable. They covered her completely from neck to wrists to ankles, as if she didn't want to show the world too much of herself. What people noticed most about her was attitude. She walked with her head down, only spoke when someone asked her a question, and even when she was in plain sight, she seemed to disappear. Some people later said that her presence was ghostly, as if she weren't really there, or as if some important part of her had gone somewhere else. Her face was pale, almost colorless, and her expression hardly ever changed. It was always careful and neutral, which made it seem like she was either deeply resigned or very disconnected from the things around her. Prudence Whitfield, the wife of a shopkeeper, later said in a 1952 statement that she had tried to talk to Minerva while the Hargraves were buying things at the general store. Prudence had asked friendly questions about how Minerva was handling being alone on their property, if she had started a garden, if she had met any of the families next door, and if she would like to join the ladies' quilting circle that met twice a month. At the church. Minerva had answered politely but briefly, and Prudence had to lean in to hear her because her voice was so soft. She said she was doing fine, that they had a small garden, and that she didn't have time for social activities. Before the conversation could go any further, Cases stepped in, putting himself between his wife and Prudence, and saying in a tone that Brooke could not argue with that his wife was happy with their arrangement and did not need to talk to anyone else. What their home gave them. Prudence said that Minerva's face during this conversation was blank, almost carefully so, as if she had trained herself not to show any reaction that could be read or questioned. Prudence said that after that, she never tried to talk to Minerva again. She also noticed that other women in town seemed to follow the same unspoken rule of leaving Mrs. Hargrave alone, as they thought it was what her husband wanted her to do. The couple had. There were no kids, which was noted but not talked about openly because it was thought to be private and possibly painful. It wasn't unusual for them not to have kids. It was not polite to ask about personal matters like why some couples chose not to have children or why they couldn't. But the Hargraves' isolation and strange behavior made the overall impression that this was not a normal household that followed the usual rules of family and community life even stronger. But the fact that there was a third person living on the property made things more complicated for the Hargrave family, which led to a lot of speculation among the few townspeople who were interested in their affairs. This man was Thaddeus Coulter, who was about 35 years old in 1904. He had a lean build that suggested he did a lot of hard physical work, reddish-brown hair that curled slightly at the collar, and a weathered face that suggested he spent most of his life outside. Coulter's connection to the Hargraves was never clearly established, and when asked directly, the man himself didn't give an answer, either avoiding the question or giving vague answers that satisfied curiosity without actually giving information. Some people thought he was a hired hand who had been brought in to help with the hard work that comes with owning a property that big, the never-ending work of cutting firewood, fixing fences, taking care of animals, and doing all the other things that living in the country required. Some people thought he might be a distant relative, like a cousin or nephew who had fallen on hard times and moved in with the Hargraves in exchange for work. A relative, maybe a cousin or nephew, who was having a hard time and had come to live with the Hargraves in exchange for work. Some people thought, without proof, that he might be some kind of helper for Cases, helping him with whatever work he did in his remote home. Coulter went to Parsons more often than Cases, usually once every 2 or 3 weeks. Merchants got used to seeing him on certain days, usually Wednesdays or Saturdays. He would come in the morning, most of the time on foot, but sometimes he would lead a mule with things being brought back to the property. He would buy things at different stores using what looked like a carefully planned list written on scraps of paper that he would check off as he got them. He didn't say much other than what he needed to finish his business. His business-like and efficient manner was different from Cases. Coulter did make eye contact, and he would say hello and answer good morning or how are you, with short but polite replies. But he never stayed to talk and always seemed eager to finish his business and leave. It was as if being in town any longer than necessary made him uncomfortable. Jonas Whitfield, the owner of the general store, kept very detailed records of all the sales he made. His father, who started the store in 1878, taught him that keeping good records was important for running a successful business. His, Coulter's, purchases followed a consistent pattern over the years, as shown by ledgers, which are large, bound books with lined pages filled with neat handwriting. He would buy the basic things that any country home would need: 50-pound bags of flour, salt, sugar, lamp oil, matches, soap, coffee, tea, and dried beans. But he also bought things that were less common and seemed to have strange amounts and frequencies. These included a lot of cotton bandages, several rolls that were replaced every few months, and several. Whitfield ordered special shipments of carbolic acid solution, tinctures, and other medicines from a pharmaceutical supplier in Wheeling. The purposes of these medicines were not always clear. For example, L-dinum, chloral hydrate, ether, and analgesic powder were all listed in the ledger. The most interesting thing was that they bought leather straps every now and then. There were very specific measurements given for everything. Whitfield's ledgers show that this happened over the years from 1897 to. Coulter bought about 2 dozen of these straps in 1904. They were all between 18 inches and 3 feet long and 1 to 2 inches wide. Made of thick, strong leather that can handle a lot of use and has extra support at the holes where the buckles would go. Whitfield once asked Coulter what the straps were for because he was curious about the repeated orders. Coulter only said that they were needed to keep the equipment on the property in good shape. An explanation that was vague enough to stop more questions, but not too vague that it doesn't make sense. After all, farms needed different kinds of straps and harnesses for animals and tools, and it was normal for them to need to be replaced often because they wore out. Whitfield wrote down these purchases in a private journal that he kept for personal notes about customers and business matters. His descendants kept it, and it is now in the Tucker County Historical Society. Whitfield wrote in July 1903 that Coulter always paid with coins that were the right amount, so he never needed change, implying that he carefully figured out how much things would cost before coming to town and brought exactly what he needed. Whitfield also said that Coulter's looks started to change in small ways in the later years, especially after 1902. He looked more tired, with a drawn face and dark circles under his eyes that made it look like he hadn't slept enough. Sometimes it looked like he was stiff, as if he was in pain, because he favored one side or moved carefully, as if he was in pain. Whitfield saw something once in the summer of 1904. There was a dark purple mark on Coulter's neck that looked like a bruise and was partially hidden by his collar. Whitfield asked if Coulter had been hurt, but the man said it was just a minor accident and that he had been hit by a swinging tree branch while clearing deadfall. He then quickly changed the subject. There wasn't much information about the 3 people who lived on the Hargrave property, other than these basic facts that came from occasional interactions and careful record-keeping. They didn't go to church at any of Parsons' 3 churches, take part in community events like harvest festivals or Independence Day celebrations, or get involved in the county's social life in any meaningful way. This isolation was not common, but it had happened before. Many people and families lived in the mountains of West Virginia because they liked being alone more than being around other people. People who had moved to the area to get away from the problems of living in more crowded places and live by their own rules, without being judged or interfered with. As long as they didn't cause any problems, paid their taxes on time, and didn't ask the community for help. People like that were usually left alone, and their strange behavior was accepted because it was part of the freedom that living in the mountains gave them. In late October 1904, A timber crew working about 5 miles from the Hargrave property heard what they said were loud screams coming from the property. This was the first sign that something was wrong. Through the woods. They said the sound came from the direction of Hargrave Place and lasted for several hours on 2 nights in a row, October 23rd and 24th. Silas Drummond, the foreman, wrote about the incident in his daily log, which the timber company required to keep track of anything that could affect work schedules or safety. At first, Drummond didn't do anything right away except write down the note in his neat handwriting. He was in his mid-40s and had been working in the woods for a long time. He knew the sounds of the forest through years of work in the logging business. At first, he thought the screaming might be animal sounds that were distorted by the valley's acoustics. In 1904, mountain lions were not very common in the area, but they were known to make sounds that could be very human-like, especially when they were mating. And the way sound bounces around in hollows could make these sounds even more distorted, making them sound closer or stronger than they really were. But when the screaming went on the third night, October 25th, Drummond changed his mind about what he thought. The sound lasted too long and was too clearly distressing to be easily dismissed as an animal. Once you listened carefully, you could tell that it was human. A quality that made it seem like language, or at least the effort to make words, but it was too far away and too distorted to tell what was being said. Several members of his crew also said they were worried about continuing to work in the area if there was something wrong with the nearby property, but no one looked into it. There was also a practical reason. Drummond wanted to avoid any legal trouble, or at least moral censure that could come from something happening to the Hargraves or their hired man, and then finding out that his crew had heard distress signals but not responded. He had to keep his reputation up with both his boss and the people in his community. Drummond and 2 other men, Wesley Pratt and Duncan McCrae and another man, both in their 30s and experienced woodsmen who had worked for the timber company for a few years, hiked to the Hargrave property. The trip took about 2 hours, and they followed game trails and logging roads through land that got steeper and harder to walk on as they got closer to the hollow where the house was. All 3 men had guns, mostly rifles, to protect themselves from dangerous animals like black bears, which usually stay away from people, but can be aggressive if they feel threatened. They were surprised, or they were protecting their young, but they also had a general feeling that they didn't know what they might find. It was cold but clear in the morning. Frost was still visible in shady spots, and their breath made clouds in the crisp air that smelled like pine and rotting leaves. Drummond's written account can be found in the Tucker County Historical Society's archives in a folder called Hargrave Property Investigation, 1904. Around mid-morning, the men came up to the Hargrave house. Drummond's pocket watch, which he got from his father and was cheap but reliable, said it was 10 o'clock. From a distance, the property looked like it hadn't been disturbed as they came out of the trees. A thin, gray column of smoke rose straight up from the chimney into the still air. This meant that a fire had been lit not too long ago, probably within the last few hours, based on the amount and color of the smoke. The few outbuildings include a small barn made of old, gray boards and a storage shed next to the tree line. Snorts didn't look hurt or out of order. Drummond thought it was strange that the gate in the fence that surrounded the yard around the house was open. He had only seen the property a few times before while surveying timber tracts in the area, so he didn't know much about it. As the men got closer, they walked slowly and called out every now and then to let people know they were there and that they meant no harm. They started to notice things that said that something was wrong. The front door was slightly ajar and swayed almost imperceptibly in the light breeze. The ground floor windows, which were usually closed at night, were open, and the curtains had been pulled back to show dark rooms. And the smell, which was faint but clear, was the most disturbing thing. One of the men later said it smelled like meat that had been left out in the heat for too long, mixed with something else, something chemical that. It burned a little in the nose and felt like it was coating the back of the throat. The smell wasn't too strong, but it was there, and it got a little stronger as they got closer to the house. It was hard to tell if it came from the house itself or from somewhere else on the property, like the barn or an outbuilding they hadn't looked at yet. Drummond yelled a few times, making their presence known and asking if anyone needed help. His voice echoed a little. In the empty space, there was no answer from him. Drummond thought the three men stood in the yard for 10 to 15 minutes arguing about what to do next in low voices. They didn't want to go into a private home without permission or clear evidence of an emergency because doing so could be seen as trespassing or cause problems with the property owners, who might just be out of town or sick for a short time. Maybe they're visiting neighbors or doing business somewhere else. But the situation seemed to call for an investigation. The open door, the weird smell, and the unexplained screaming from the nights before. All of these things made it seem like something had gone wrong, and that the people living there might be hurt or need help that they couldn't get on their own. After a long time of not knowing what to do, they circled the house from a distance and checked the outbuildings. But no one was there. The barn was empty, except for some hay and a few tools, so Drummond decided to go inside. The three men walked up to thee. Drummond led the way to the front door, holding his rifle ready but not aiming it, and pushed it all the way open. The hinges creaked a little, making a high-pitched noise that was loud in the quiet. The door swung open to show a front hall with a narrow table with an oil lamp on it against one wall and a parlor beyond it. From the doorway, they could see right inside, and what they saw was both comforting and confusing. The house was very clean, almost too clean, with everything in its place and no sign of disorder. In its proper place, with no signs of messiness. The way the furniture was arranged made it look like it had been carefully planned. The floors were clean, and everything seemed to be in its right place. There was no sign of life in the house, and the silence was complete, except for the ticking of a clock somewhere deeper in the house, which made the emptiness seem even more real. The men walked in slowly, and their boots made hollow sounds on the wooden floors that were too loud. They kept calling out, but got no answer. There were 4 main rooms on the ground floor. The front parlor had chairs arranged around a cold fireplace. The dining area had a long table and 6 chairs. The kitchen was at the back of the house and had a cast-iron stove and well-stocked shelves. The study, or office space, looked like it belonged to Cash Hargrave, with a desk, bookshelves, and lots of papers. There was no sign of struggle, panic, or even a hasty departure in any of the rooms. A book in the parlor. It was open on a side table next to a chair, as if someone had been reading it and then put it down to come back later. Drummond said that the book was a book of philosophy, but he didn't know the author's name. In the study, papers were neatly stacked on a desk, and writing tools were carefully placed in a wooden holder. There were still ashes in the fireplace in the parlor from a fire that had happened recently. When Drummond carefully touched the ashes with his hand, he found that they still had some warmth, which means that the fire had burned in the last 12 to 24 hours. They found something in the kitchen that made them think their routine had been broken. There was a pot of stew on the cast-iron stove. It was cold, but it looked like it had been made recently, maybe the day before. The food inside, which looked like venison with vegetables, hadn't started to go bad yet, but it would soon if it wasn't kept cold. 3 bowls sat on the kitchen table, spaced out carefully at 3 points, which was more telling. 2 of these. The bowls had partially eaten stew in them, and the spoons were resting at angles as if they had been set down during the meal. There were only a few drops of gravy on the bottom and sides of the 3rd bowl, which means that its contents had been completely eaten. There were 3 spoons next to the bowls. The way things were set up made it look like a meal had been interrupted, but there was no sign of a fight or panic. It looked like the diners had carefully and purposefully set everything down, as if just stopped eating, got up, and left, planning to come back, but never did. Drummond and his friends searched the ground floor very carefully, opening cabinets and closets, looking behind furniture and checking any place where someone might be hiding or where a body might have been hidden. They found food and supplies in a pantry off the kitchen that were typical of a household getting ready for winter. Several bags of cornmeal and flour, jars of fruits and vegetables that have been preserved. There were barrels of apples and potatoes, shelves with cured meat hanging from hooks in the ceiling, and more. Everything seemed to be in its place, and nothing seemed out of place. Drummond looked at some of the papers on the desk as part of the study, but he later said he felt bad about it because it felt like he was invading someone's privacy, and they might come back at any time and ask him why. Most of the papers looked like financial records, like lists of costs and income from property holdings in other places, implying that Caches had other ways to get money besides the farm. There were also a few letters, but Drummond didn't read them closely because he thought it would be an invasion of privacy, since they hadn't yet proven that a crime had happened. There were 3 bedrooms and a small bathroom with a sink and pitcher on the 2nd floor of the house. It looked like 2 of the bedrooms were being used regularly. The beds were made neatly, and personal items were arranged on the dressers and tables. One bedroom clearly belonged to Cases and Minerva. It had a big bed with a dark wooden frame, a wardrobe with carved doors, and a writing desk by the window that looked out over the forest. The dressing table had feminine things on it, and the wardrobe had masculine clothes in it. The 2nd bedroom was smaller and less furnished. It had only a narrow bed, a small chest of drawers, and a chair. Based on the simple furniture and the fact that it was Thaddeus Coulter's room, lack of personal decoration. It looked like the 3rd bedroom was mostly a place to store things, with trunks and boxes piled up against the walls. The contents of these boxes and trunks were unknown and not labeled. Once more, everything was in order. There was no sign of violence, no sign that anyone had to leave quickly. Clothes were hanging in closets. The jewelry boxes on the dressing table held their contents without being disturbed, and the personal items were arranged as they would be in a home where people lived and planned to return. After finishing Drummond searched the upper floor and found no signs of the resident's absence. That's when he noticed the door to the cellar, which was near the pantry entrance off the kitchen. He had seen it when they first entered, but he hadn't thought about how important it was, or that it might need to be looked into right away. Now that he was standing in front of it, he felt a reluctance that he later called instinctual, as if he knew that whatever answers there were about the missing house would be found below. Ground. The other 2 men seemed to feel the same way, and they stood for a long time looking at the closed door before Drummond reached out and turned the handle. The latch on the cellar door was easy to lift, and the door was open. There was a narrow stairway that went down into the dark. The steps were steep, and there was no railing. Drummond took a lamp from the kitchen, lit it with a match from his pocket, and led the way down. The lamp made moving shadows on the walls. The steps were steep and turned sharply after a dozen steps, so they couldn't see what was below until they got to the bottom. As they went down, the air got noticeably cooler, dropping by about 10 or 15 degrees. There was a smell of earth and stone, which is what cellars usually smell like, but there was also something chemical and faintly organic underneath it that made all 3 men stop and look at each other even before they got to the bottom of the stairs. When they got there, the cellar was split into 2 parts, Even in the dim light of the lamp, it was clear right away. The first part, where the stairs went down, was a normal storage area with a low ceiling held up by thick wooden beams that were showing their age through small cracks and weathering. The walls were made of stone and packed earth, and the floor was hard-packed dirt that was dry and even, without the moisture that many cellars had to deal with. One wall had shelves with jars of different sizes and preserved foods on them. There were a lot of tools hanging up, like saws and hammers, on pegs and in storage for household items that weren't being used. The area was tidy and well organized, which made it look like it was used and cleaned often. 2 small windows set high in the walls at ground level let in light once a week. They didn't let in a lot of light, but they were enough to see by during the day. But the second part was what really caught their attention and would stay with them for the rest of their lives. A heavy wooden door with an iron lock separated this part from the main storage area. Different in how it was built and what it was used for, in ways that made it clear this was not a normal part of a cellar in a house. The door was open when the men came down, and a jar was hanging from it, as if someone had left in a hurry and hadn't had time to lock it, or maybe they just couldn't lock it for some reason. They could see a room through the opening that was nothing like what they would expect to find in a rural cellar. It was unlike anything any of them had ever seen in their combined decades of experience. Drummond walked slowly, holding the lamp in front of him at arm's length. He could feel his friends close behind him, close enough that he could hear their breathing getting faster. The room next door was about 12 feet by 15 feet, and the walls had been plastered smooth and painted white. This is an odd choice because it would take a lot of work to do in this space and wouldn't be useful for a storage area. The paint was surprisingly clean, with no mildew or stains like you would expect. In a basement room where it was always going to be wet, the floor was made of wooden planks that were carefully put together so that the seams were almost invisible. It looked like there were several coats of varnish on the wood, which made it smooth and shiny, like glass, and reflected the light from the lamp. The ceiling was a little higher than in the outer cellar, maybe 7 feet in the middle. It was also plastered and painted white to match the walls. 3 lamps hung from hooks that were screwed into the ceiling beams. They were placed so that the light was even. When all of them were lit, the whole room was bright. A workbench made of thick, planed, smooth timbers was set up along one wall. The timbers had been put together with obvious skill and care. The bench's surface was badly scarred and stained, showing that it had been used a lot for a long time. The gouges and marks on it showed that it had been hit many times and damaged by chemicals. There were different sizes and shapes of glass containers on top of it. Some were empty, and others held liquids of unknown origin, different colors. The liquids were clear, amber, or something darker that could have been brown or deep red, but it was hard to tell for sure in the lamplight. Some of these bottles had handwritten labels in a neat, careful hand. At the time, the words on the labels didn't mean anything to Drummond, but he later copied some of them into his report. Chloral hydrate, L-dynam, carbolic acid solution, tincture of opium, ether, and atropine sulfate. There were at least a dozen notebooks on the shelves above the bench, all of them bound in. Dark leather and the same size, about 8 by 10 inches, arranged in a neat row like books in a library. Their spines had no marks on them except for numbers. Next to the notebooks were a few tools that men who were used to farm tools and forestry equipment didn't know what they were for right away. There were small knives with blades that curved in different ways. Some were only a few inches long, while others were a little bigger. All of them looked very sharp. There were metal probes of different lengths and widths, some of which were straight like needles. Others that had small curves or hooks at the ends that made it look like they were meant for a specific purpose. There were clamps of different sizes and shapes, as well as devices with screws that could be tightened or loosened to change the amount of pressure they applied. Their purpose was not clear, but they looked threatening. There were also what looked like measuring tools, such as several types of thermometers, rulers with very fine gradations that were much more accurate than those used in carpentry, and something that. It looked like a small scale for weighing things, but it measured in grains instead of pounds. But what caught the men's attention the most? What made them stand still in the doorway for so long, with only their own breathing breaking the silence? The clock ticking in the distance upstairs was the thing in the middle of the room. A big oak chair with a high back and wide arms that had been worn smooth by use. The chair was bolted to the floor in a way that made it very safe. There are thick lag bolts at each leg that are driven deep into the wood planks and are probably anchored to the stone foundation below. There were leather straps, wide and strong, with metal buckles on the arms and legs. The buckles showed a lot of wear from being used over and over again. The leather got darker, and the metal got scratched. The straps on the arms were placed to keep the wrists in place, and the straps on the legs were made to keep the ankles still. And there were more straps hanging from the back of the chair at different heights. Clearly meant to hold someone's torso in place at several points and keep them completely still while they are sitting. The chair itself looked like it had been used a lot for a long time. The wood was darkly stained in some places, like the arms where hands would rest and the seat, where the staining had gone deep into the grain even though it looked like it had been cleaned. Even though the leather straps were kept in good shape and seemed to be oiled to keep them soft, they had been worn smooth where they would touch skin. The texture is different from parts that haven't been used, which suggests that the item has been used many times over the course of years. The marks on the floor around the chair were the most scary. The dark stains had soaked deep into the wood grain of the planks, making patterns that spread out from the base of the chair in uneven streaks and spatters. Someone had tried to clean these stains, as shown by the lighter spots where the surface layer of varnish and the spilled stuff had been scrubbed off. But the wood had soaked up the liquid too well to be completely removed, and the stains showed up as darker shadows on the otherwise smooth, varnished surface, leaving a permanent record of what had happened in this room.